But that means there's something that a human could do that God can't do. And at first you just want to say, like, no, that's not true. God can do anything. And it is true that God can do anything. He is omnipotent. But there are lots of things that God can't do that human beings can do. God can't get tired. He can't catch a cold. He can't grow old. He can't, he can't sneeze. All those kinds of things. These are things that human beings can do that God can't do, and there's lots of them. In fact, God can't change at all. He's changeless. Okay, so that's really important to know. God is changeless. So anything we can do, like making mistakes, growing older, learning things, God can't do any of that. Another thing that I find very interesting, I mentioned this a little bit in a previous episode, but God can, one of the greatest acts of God is he can create something that can do something that he can't do. So he can create us, but we can give him something, our love, that he can't create. Free love, right? At least because he put that limitation on himself that he won't force us to. He could have created us just automatically loving him, but that's a whole different conversation. So all these things that we're talking about that God can't do, that human beings can do, these are because we're limited being. He's unlimited being. The reason I die is because my being's limited and finite. It's not the fullness of being. I'm more non-existent than I am existent. And that's the same for anything. The reason God can't walk around the block is because he's not limited. And we are limited. And that's one of the ways, very important ways we get to know God is through what's known as the via negativa. Say, thinking about him, and these are things we can say for sure are true about God. They're not analogies. Is the negative way. Things that anything that implies imperfection is not true of God. So we know he's not physical. We know he doesn't have a temper. So things like that that are the result of finitude or finiteness or limited being, we can say, yeah, that's not true of God. And this is one of the really, really important ways to know who God is. But of course, now here's the caveat. As Christians, we know that Jesus became incarnate and he became a human being. So the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The second person of the Holy Trinity became a human being. So now God can actually do all these things. He joined himself to human nature. That's what the incarnation is. And that's very important. Remember that. We'll talk about that later on, joining himself to human nature. Now, God could have his diaper changed when he was a baby. He could get tired. He could get annoyed. Either at the kids that were bugging him, the apostles that got annoyed. Maybe he was annoyed too and he just controlled it. But more likely, where we see very obviously he's annoyed, he could get annoyed at the apostles, right? And at us too. So he's everything that we are, but except for sin. So he experiences everything we experience but sin, right? That's from Hebrews 4:15, or also you could look at Philippians 2:7, where he was known to be of human estate, that it was thus that he humbled himself. Okay, so why did God do this? It wasn't just so he could experience human nature. He did it to save us, right? And it's very important because we had a debt. It's like we owed $1 million that we couldn't pay, and God had the $1 million but didn't need to pay because he didn't owe it. So how do we do that? How does he solve that? Is he becomes one of us who owes the $1 million, right? And we're like, hey, sometimes we're like, oh, that's not really fair. And we could do a longer episode on this, but that's not really fair that God makes us owe that money. Well, let's think about that. So God is infinite goodness. That's what he is, right? Infinite being. That's what we've been talking about. And when we sin, we assault infinite goodness. The goodness in every single thing, we assault that. So that has to be made right somehow, some way. For example, think about it in this way. If I just punch somebody on the street, that's a certain level of crime. If I punch the president, that's a higher level of crime because of who he is and what he represents. Well, if I punch God, which is what sin is, that's infinitely worse than punching the president or anybody else. So the damage I've done, and it's not just because God represents something, he is all goodness. The goodness in every single thing is God. So it makes a disorder in the universe when we sin. And an infinitely bad disorder, because God is infinitely good. So we have to pay back infinite, but we can't pay back infinite. So there's two objections that sometimes people think about that with the incarnation. First, why couldn't God just be like, okay, I forgive you for all that. Oh, it's all good. And just forget about it. Forget about the sins. Well, there's a difference between forgiving and condoning or just ignoring, right? God cares about us. He loves us. So when there's something bad or evil that somebody does to us and we don't care about them, we're just not going to deal with it. We just ignore it. God can't do that. Or we just say, oh, it's not really that bad. But God can't do that either, because it really is that bad, our sins. But why didn't he just give us the money, in my analogy, that we owed? Why didn't he just give it? Why did he do this whole long, complicated thing? Well, that's what the incarnation is. That is him just giving us the money. That's what it is.